In the 70s, punk music exploded onto the British scene. Following partly in the footsteps of late 60s counterculture and the protest music that it produced, punk music seemed to be propelled by the rebellious energy of 60s radicalism, as it itself was rebellious, oppositional, fast and aggressive, and fed up with the status quo. Professing a DIY philosophy, it showed that a musical scene could thrive independently of the pre-existing musical establishment, and while many punk musicians lacked formal training or technical prowess, they made up for it with their energy and conviction. One could say that punk was to the music scene what Napoleon was to Europe, a destructive force which razed what had been previously established to the ground, clearing out the space for the birth of something new. By the late 70s, however, the punk scene was running out of steam, declining just as political radicalism was declining, and a section of the punk scene was growing tired of the standard three-chord punk formula, and opening the scene up to a wider range of influences and ideas developed into what is now known as post-punk, named that way precisely because it arrived after the heyday of the first wave of punk music. While punk was characterized by its energy, speed, and aggression, post-punk came to be characterized by mood, atmosphere, and expression. While punk directed its anger outwardly, post-punk often turned inwards, introspecting about the self and its place in society, or lack thereof. In addition to those that were slow and gloomy, there were strains of post-punk that took inspiration from funk, reggae, and even disco, often taking on an ironic and satirical tone. Arriving on the eve of deindustrialization and the decline of British social democracy, it came to define the mood of an entire generation of young people. And despite its often pessimistic tone, post-punk constituted a period of intense experimentation and musical innovation. It opened itself up to a wide range of influences and expanded its horizons, creating something that was truly new. The late theorist Mark Fisher argued that the post-punk scene constituted a level of innovation and experimentation within pop culture that had scarcely been matched since. For Fisher, post-punk was part of a British cultural network that constituted a period of what he called popular modernism, a network that included, quote, the music press and the more challenging parts of public service broadcasting, as well as post-punk, brutalist architecture, penguin paperbacks, and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Post-punk was the soundtrack of this period of popular modernism, as well as its swan song. To understand the significance of the term popular modernism, one has to first understand how modernism was viewed before it. Modernism as an art movement tends to refer to the first half of the 20th century, and is an extremely broad term, identified in painting, literature, theater, music, and architecture, and including a subset of art movements as wide-ranging as Expressionism, Constructivism, Futurism, Cubism, Surrealism, and several others. But what mainly united these highly varied aesthetic movements was the attempt to overcome the past, to break new ground, to experiment without compromising, and to create something genuinely new. In their content, modernist works were often expressions of life and human experience in secular, urban, industrialized society, reflecting its acceleration, its alienation, as well as its innovation. But what is typically seen as the central aspect of modernism is not necessarily the content it portrayed, but its form, namely its incessant formal experimentation, in which the content sometimes became secondary to form. Modernist artists believed that the societal changes unfolding were so drastic and transformative that they required the creation of new art forms and new ways of seeing. They did not simply seek to depict new things, but to create entirely new forms of depiction. However, modernism was also often seen as a somewhat elitist affair. The German philosopher Theodor Adorno was a great proponent of modernist art, and he saw it as fundamentally opposed to mass culture or popular culture, at least as it existed in his time. In Adorno's influential view, popular culture under advanced capitalism was merely a product of what he called the culture industry, a concept I go into in my video on the Emoji Movie. The products of the culture industry were commercial and profit-driven, and both an expression of human unfreedom and a tool of domination. Adorno believed that pop culture under capitalism was incapable of producing something new, and believed that its only effect was to lull and pacify the masses. Modernist art, for him, could only retain some level of aesthetic autonomy in strict opposition to popular culture, even if this meant giving up any hope of popular appeal or commercial success. A lot of past European art had been created for religious purposes, and so it was subservient to religion. What made modernist art special for Adorno was its goal of complete aesthetic autonomy, in opposition to any kind of subservience. It was by holding up the ideal of autonomy that modernist art was capable of exposing and resisting a world which completely lacked autonomy. He wrote that artworks detach themselves from the empirical world and bring forth another world, one opposed to the empirical world. It was the incessant formal experimentation, as mentioned earlier, that made possible this overcoming of immediate reality. In Adorno's view, great modernist art opened up a contradiction between the aesthetic freedom of the artwork and the unfree world in which it was produced, thereby exposing a contradiction which could only be solved by overcoming our unfree world. Pop culture, however, in his view, was completely subservient to commerce and profitability, and so could not produce anything autonomous. It was in opposition to this view that Mark Fisher coined the term popular modernism. He believed that in certain periods and in certain cases, the distinction between modernism and popular culture was overcome, producing something popular yet not populist, modernist yet working class. Post-punk was popular yet modernist in its formal experimentation. In late 70s UK, Mark Fisher writes, particular modernist techniques were not only disseminated but collectively reworked and extended, just as the modernist task of producing forms which were adequate to the present moment was taken up and renewed.
Oh, I was called out when the going gets tough. Things you've learned are no longer enough.
The musicians of the British post-punk scene were absolutely steeped in modernist culture. Their names, lyrics, artworks, and aesthetic approaches were full of references to surrealism, Dada, futurism, constructivism, as well as science fiction, critical theory, and existentialist literature. The music journalist and critic Simon Reynolds wrote how the post-punk scene from 1978 to 1984 contained, quote, the systematic ransacking of 20th century modernist art and literature. The entire post-punk period looks like an attempt to replay virtually every major modernist theme and technique via the medium of pop music. And so, through the post-punk scene, these modernist works and artistic approaches reached a relatively broad working-class audience. Quote, Cabaret Voltaire borrowed their name from Dada. Pere Ubu took theirs from Alfred Jarry. Talking Heads turned a Hugo Ball sound poem into a tribal disco dance track. Gang of Four, inspired by Brecht and Godard's alienation effects, tried to deconstruct rock even as they rocked hard. Lyricists absorbed the radical science fiction of William S. Burroughs, J.G. Ballard, and Philip K. Dick, and techniques of collage and cut-up were transplanted into the music, with graphic designers like Malcolm Garrett and Peter Saville and labels like Factory and Fast Product drawing from constructivism, de stijl, Bauhaus, John Heartfield, and Die Neue Typographie. Of course, the point of all of these influences was not just to pay homage, but to use them as a stepping stone for further innovation, because the post-punk musicians saw in the modernist movement aspects that had not been explored yet, new possibilities to be extracted. They believed that there were yet more futures to be created in the cultural scene. And many post-punk musicians were not only well-read and cultured, but also politically educated, and sometimes expressed radical political sympathies and social criticism through their lyrics. There was Gang of Four, for instance, who had clear Marxist influences, with their name being a reference to a Maoist faction within the Chinese Communist Party. There was the Durruti column, their name being a reference to the Spanish anarchist revolutionary fighter Buenaventura Durruti, as well as Scritti Politti, a band name which paid homage to the Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, while their songs also involved references to French philosophers like Derrida, Lacan, and Roland Barthes. Politically oriented musicians sometimes saw their own musical activity through a political lens, forming art collectives in which working-class musicians could share instruments and equipment, and conceiving independent record distribution as being kind of an alternative form of the cultural means of production. It thereby involved the explicit attempt to produce an alternative to the culture industry.
There was this whole idea of somehow kind of controlling the means of production. Again, through questioning things, we were questioning contracts, we were realizing that things were just being corrupted and taken away and polished up and made into like shawadi-wadi punk. Or children's TV punk, right? And so we wanted to kind of have control over what we were doing.
With its openness to experimentation, the post-punk scene would also lead to the development of new subgenres. One of the pioneers of goth rock, for instance, was the post-punk band Bauhaus, who took their name from the influential German modernist school of architecture. And the goth scene in general took great inspiration from the modernist art strain of expressionism.
Lies, the black box. Bela Lugosi's dead. Cracking through the walls, it's then spinning. You have no choice.
So I say, sing to the dawn.
Another factor of innovation was the growing accessibility of synthesizers. Before post-punk, synthesizers were seen sort of as a bourgeois instrument. A synthesizer could be as expensive as a small house, and so was typically used by wealthy or well-established musicians. By the late 70s, however, the development of more affordable synthesizers for the first time created the possibility of working-class synth music. Some musicians would even cut costs by building their own synthesizers and hardware. Synthesizers greatly expanded the range of available sounds and led to even more formal experimentation, with subgenres like minimal wave, which was a more stripped-down and mechanical-sounding form of post-punk, and minimal synth, which was often entirely synthesized with the exception of vocals. Their approach to synthesizers was thoroughly modernist, in the way that they used rudimentary building blocks to create interesting shapes and spaces.
The path of least resistance. This seems the only way.
Nature intended the abstract for you and me.
Scratch his head, the fucking deal. Reached out for a glass of beer. Break his hand.
Such musicians often drew from modernist science fiction and futurism, with futurist influences and homemade electronics also leading to the development of industrial music.
Are you ready, boys? Are you ready, girls? Are you ready, boys? Let's get the bliss. He were the ends, he were the power, he had the lies, and there was something deeper.
It is striking that all of these new forms of musical expression and innovations in genre happened within the span of less than a decade. And what made this possible in the UK, Mark Fisher argues, was social democracy. Mark Fisher agreed with Adorno that cultural innovation and the market are opposed to one another. However, in Fisher's view, Post-war social democracy with its considerable public spending created limited spaces of refuge from market forces, and thereby facilitated the post-punk scene's extensive innovation. One of the most significant cases of this public spending for post-punk were art schools, as at this time the UK had entirely free state-funded art schools, and gave out student maintenance grants as well. This meant that creatively minded working-class youth were able to attend art school without worrying about tuition and financial expenses, and spent several years simply educating themselves and experimenting. It was often in the art schools that young working-class artists steeped themselves in modernist art and culture, and also became familiar with literature, critical theory, and contemporary philosophy. The art schools were thus a breeding ground of intense musical creativity. Some cultural activities were also publicly funded by the Arts Council. For instance, it was a grant from a regional branch of the Arts Council that led to the creation of the Manchester Music Collective, where the legendary post-punk band Joy Division were regular participants, and post-punk band The Fall play their first gig. Joy Division's Ian Curtis said that this collective gave them a place to play, meet other musicians, discuss and swap ideas, and experiment in front of people. It was these public spaces that made such intense experimentation possible. Because the musicians involved did not have to worry about being immediately commercially successful, they could afford to take risks. Musicians who could not yet make a living off their music would also sometimes take unemployment benefits, because nothing kills artistic creativity as much as the need to constantly think about commercial appeal. In Mark Fisher's view, it was therefore public funding that partially made popular modernism possible in the 70s, because as a counterforce to the culture industry, it allowed artists to be ahead of their time. This is also why Fisher mentions public service broadcasting, which involved a lot of experimentation by filmmakers, and the publicly funded BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which famously created the Doctor Who theme, made incredible advances in developing electronic music. This influential cultural force was closed down in the 90s precisely because it was deemed not profitable enough. And this is also why Mark Fisher mentions Brutalism as part of popular modernism. Brutalist architecture was itself a broadly modernist development, and often being publicly funded, at its best it produced incredibly forward-thinking and formally innovative architecture. Brutalism was anti-nostalgic, formal, shunning decorations and emphasizing its material and its visual coherence. And there is a deep affinity between post-punk and brutalism for these reasons. Post-punk often sounds like a sonic representation of brutalist architecture. It's bass-heavy, spacious, stripped-down, angular, lacking excessive flair, and often minimalist, but nevertheless formally interesting. Nowadays, it is precisely because of a lack of public funding that brutalist buildings are not well maintained and end up deteriorating. Mark Fisher said in an interview, quote, "Just consider a city like London. The most futuristic parts of the city are the brutalist ones. You go to the Barbican Centre and you spontaneously think about the future, precisely because of the modernism of the buildings." This, like post-punk, is part of our condition of cultural hauntology that Mark Fisher spoke of, which I have a video on if you'd like to learn more. This condition is characterized by the fact that, ironically, we often have to go back a couple of decades into the past to discover something that feels futuristic, because the market has no time for the future. It only looks as far as the next production cycle. It's no surprise that the affinity between post-punk and brutalism has remained to this day. One of the most popular contemporary post-punk bands that draw on this tradition, the Belarusian group Molchat Doma, used the iconic brutalist Hotel Panorama building for their album art, which looks futuristic even today. Of course, many of the new commercial buildings are themselves designed in broadly modernist style, and yet, as products of the free market, they offer a completely lifeless, tedious, and banal kind of modernism, a kind of IKEA modernism, completely devoid of the futuristic aspects that modernism was once identified with. They hardly embody the modernist ideal of constant formal innovation, and modernist aesthetics themselves become degraded when appropriated by neoliberalism. The British writer Owen Heatherly wrote that modernism might have resurged, but in much the same way that a Labour government is no longer a Labour government, it isn't quite the same modernism. Such buildings are commercial investments more than they are architectural experiments. Of course, speaking of public spending and brutalism, it's impossible not to mention the Soviet Union as well. Although Soviet culture was, without a doubt, restrictive in many ways and involved a lot of censorship, its extensive public spending also created non-commercial spaces of intense artistic creativity, notably not only in architecture, but also cinema.
Back when Russia was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they'd say, "Oh, but aren't you so glad that you're in America?" I said, "Well, I know a lot of Russian filmmakers. They have a lot more freedom than I have. All they have to do is be careful about criticizing the government. Otherwise, they can do anything they want."
And so what do you have to do?
You have to adhere to a very narrow line of commercialism.
In the post-war period, the Soviet Union created many cases of extremely forward-thinking brutalist architecture. Sometimes architects were given great artistic freedom and space to experiment, even in areas as mundane as that of bus stops. And the Eastern Bloc had a post-punk scene as well, where the significance of public funding was even more direct. Soviet-aligned states not only, of course, fully funded arts education, but also funded youth cultural centers and even entire musical festivals, such as the Yarochin Festival in the People's Republic of Poland, which was of immense significance to the development of Polish punk and post-punk, creating a unique situation in which a center of counterculture which included a lot of anti-government sentiment was fully funded by the state. But at the end of the day, this is a YouTube video essay, which means that one thing is inevitable: neoliberalism. While the British post-punk scene depended on social democratic conditions, it was developing under a social and economic crisis that marked the final years of post-war British social democracy, and it witnessed how the very conditions that allowed it to thrive were consciously and systematically destroyed. It thereby ended up being the soundtrack of the social crisis and decay that would mark the neoliberal 80s. Mark Fisher writes, quote, "The subsequent ideological and practical attack on public services meant that one of the spaces where artists could be sheltered from the pressure to produce something that was immediately successful was severely circumscribed. As public service broadcasting became marketized, there was an increased tendency to turn out cultural productions that resembled what was already successful. The social time available for withdrawing from work and immersing oneself in cultural production drastically declined. If there's one factor above all else which contributes to cultural conservatism, it is the vast inflation in the cost of rent and mortgages. It's no accident that the efflorescence of cultural invention in London and New York in the late 1970s and early 80s, in the punk and post-punk scenes, coincided with the availability of squatted and cheap property in those cities. Since then, the decline of social housing, the attacks on squatting, and the delirious rise in property prices have meant that the amount of time and energy available for cultural production has massively diminished. And so, as the rise in the cost of living, the dismantling of free education, and the decline of the public sphere eradicated the conditions in which post-punk was born, many of the independent record labels at the head of the movement were either bought up or went bankrupt. The shift from social democracy to neoliberalism was also inseparable from deindustrialization. With so many factories closing down, there were entire towns that had been built around industry, which now found themselves losing the social purpose and meaning that they had developed around. Manchester, which had been the world's first great industrial city, was now one of the first cities to enter the post-industrial era, and its atmosphere of decline gave birth to legendary post-punk bands like Joy Division and The Fall. Richard Boone, who had funded The Fall's first EP, said of their song Industrial Estate that it is, quote, a very funny take on Manchester's history of having been the cradle of capitalism, and then by the 1970s, its grave. The modernist movement had appeared in conditions of intense industrialization, and now the end of popular modernism was signaled by deindustrialization. There was a steep rise in unemployment, and the social stability and security that had characterized the post-war period was rapidly disappearing. One could say that while the counterculture of the late 60s rebelled against its assigned place in society, the countercultural youth of the early 80s no longer had a place in society to rebel against.
In the beginning of the 80s, there was a lot of unemployment, and all the young people, we couldn't get any jobs. And the generation before us, the hippies, we hated the hippies because they were talking about peace, love, and understanding, and they had all the culture jobs. They were sitting on those. They could do records, they could do everything, and we couldn't do anything. So the only space was left for us at that time was do a protest against all the good feelings and good things they were doing.
Perhaps such conditions gave an even greater allure to brutalist architecture, as it now symbolized the bygone period of relative social stability, and, like post-punk itself, the austere and formal nature of brutalist architecture served as a cultural opposition to the colorful and excessive consumerism of the 80s. Neoliberalism affected both West and East, and the post-punk scenes were reacting to quite similar social conditions on both sides of the Iron Curtain: social and economic crisis, the decline of public spending, and the loss of social stability. Union workers in the UK, with the striking miners at the forefront, were facing violent state repression at the hands of Thatcher's government. And on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Poland, which also had a large post-punk scene in development, and which at this time was nominally socialist, was actually selling coal to Thatcher, thus helping her resist the miners' strike. And at the same time, this Polish government was assaulting its own striking workers, who at the time were organizing one of the period's largest labor unions, known as Solidarity. In both countries, the crisis was managed through state violence and austerity, and privatization was massively extended, ending the period of popular modernism. Many young artists in the Eastern Bloc were hoping that, once the government's restrictions on culture were removed, there would be an explosion of new cultural forms. But in many cases they discovered that, under the new neoliberal conditions, the market could be more totalitarian in its grip on culture than any state. Many of the brutalist buildings which had previously expressed utopian social ideals were demolished, or simply abandoned and left to deteriorate because their new private owners were unwilling or incapable of funding their maintenance. A lot of brutalist architecture had been the result of the ambitious post-war attempt to build a new world, and the demolition and abandonment of these buildings now served as the perfect symbol of the end of that project. In Mark Fisher's words, it symbolized the cancellation of the future, leading people to feel nostalgic for a future that never arrived. And much of post-punk reflected this prevailing atmosphere. It felt cold, damp, barren, evoking images of closed-down factories, dirty streets, and urban decay. One has to be careful when looking back at 70s popular modernism, or any other period of past cultural creativity, for fear of getting stuck in the past and only looking backwards. After all, the modernism of yesterday can sometimes become the cultural conservatism of today. Mark Fisher's intention was definitely not returning to an ideal past, nor was it to idealize British social democracy or the Soviet system, both of which were not without their problems, to say the least. The point of such cultural study is to discover what made past cultural moments possible, and the way the post-punk scene did with modernism, to find in it possibilities that have not been explored yet. One could criticize the post-punk scene's sense of resignation, condemn it for being defeatist and quietist, see it as capitulation to the present state of things. One could argue that it should have been more agitational and used more for propagandistic purposes. But Simon Reynolds wrote that many of the politically conscious post-punk musicians, quote, saw the plain-spoken demagoguery of overtly politicized musicians of the era as far too literal and unaesthetic, and found their soapbox sermonizing both condescending to the listener and, most of the time, a pointless exercise in preaching to the converted. This is a very Adornian position. And so, more sympathetically, we could view post-punk's approach the way Adorno viewed modernist art, as holding out the possibility of autonomy. Adorno believed that just as the autonomy of art is violated when it is subordinated to religious purposes or commercial purposes, that this likewise happens when it is subordinated to political pragmatics. That when made agitational and propagandistic, art becomes one with the very world that it should oppose itself to. If one accepts this perspective, one could say that there's in fact something utopian about post-punk even at its most depressive. Because, Adorno argues, it is only by recognizing and exposing the absolute wretchedness of the present moment that you can hold out any possibility of a different, better world. In Mark Fisher's words, quote, "The political significance of working-class creativity in popular music was that it gave us vivid glimpses and tastes of this other world, a world that, via these anticipations and rehearsals, at least intersected with ours, or became ours, intermittently yet insistently. A world in which the old dandy flaneur ambition for life to become a work of art would be democratized, where the mass-produced and the bespoke would combine in unexpected ways, where no detail was too small to be attended to, and fashion would be as significant as fine art. This was the future that popular modernism prefigured and made available in flashes." And now I'd like to thank my patrons, who provide me with the space of creative freedom in making these videos. 404 Error, Just Undo It, Andre Oliva, Archive Transients, Beetle Scratches, Ben E, Big Hat Artorias, Celsius Enjoyer, Circadia, Confirmatio Namae Matthew Dominic, Daniel Zotner, Drain Gang Padania, Evie Rosk, Eric Owens, Francois Yue Wu, Harbin Moths, Hong Kong Aesthetics, Is It Really Possible for a Detournement Girl and a Recuperation Boy to Be in a Relationship? John D. Pagani, Katy Perry Is John Benet Ramsey, Clement Fies, M. Lim, Max Bendick, Max Murphy, Nathaniel Lark, Nathaniel Owen, Paul Winfer, PDXJ Morris, Polecat, Post Elvis, Rachel Ann, Radical Q, Sky, Stack Smyrner, Saibundit, The Empty Set, Venice, Victor Redco, Wentao Sui, Yesterday's Rice, as well as all of these wonderful patrons. If you're new to the genre of post-punk and you're interested in listening to the classics, I will post some recommendations either in the video description or the comments. This video topic was selected by my patrons, and if you become my patron at any tier, you can also participate in video polls determining the next video. If there's any interest in it, I might sometime release a kind of sequel to this video in which I would talk about the development of industrial music. If you join my Patreon, you will find the video script, additional reading recommendations, as well as some instrumental post-punk I made for this video myself. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a beautiful summer. Thank you.